God wakes up, as she must, for I'm still alive and I choose to continue breathing life into her. And she wakes up in a pile of garbage near Washington Square Park. How did she get there? Well, you see, neither you nor I can be sure of what really has been going on with our female embodiment of God, wouldn't you say? I mean, first there was the lamentation pond, and then there was the stumbling into the male embodiment of God at Borough Hall, and then God walked across the Brooklyn Bridge and shot a police officer with a gun that she produced from thin air, and then she was taken to the police station, which began flooding, and was finally released, escorted out into a crowd of reporters, and then transported to some sort of fantastic nightmare realm, where she was trapped in a box with no sides, and she had a wound that couldn't bleed, and she kept thinking that it was a dream, but she didn't want to wake up, because if she woke up, she'd have to accept the fact that she isn't God. So here we are now, and God's lying in a pile of trash on Washington Place, where a lot of homeless people hang out, and God's asleep, and she isn't God, even though she is. And it's just coming on evening, and there's no wind, but that makes everything worse. It's cold, and there's nothing anyone can do to escape the cold, but some people can wear big comfy jackets, and some people get to go home to a nice heated apartment, and that makes the cold worse for everyone who doesn't have those luxuries. God stirs because she hasn't eaten breakfast at the shelter. There's a meal coming up at 5 at the Bowery Mission. God doesn't beg. After breakfast, she walked around a bit. She's old and frail, so she can't go fast, but she still likes to walk. So she walked over to East River Park, and when she got there, she had to sit down for a while because she was too cold and tired. There weren't many people there. Most of them were bums and dreamers. She likes the dreamers better than the bums, mostly because she used to be a dreamer herself. Why isn't she a dreamer anymore? Well, you see, darling, everyone starts out a dreamer. In fact, our lives themselves are only dreams, and as we begin to nurse from our mother's milk, we become indoctrinated with all the beliefs that our mother has accumulated throughout her life, the process of which began with her first taste of her own mother's milk. And these beliefs that we gain from our mother are actually false beliefs. They tell us that we are our body, and that the purpose of our life is to make money, and that God is something other than ourselves, and that we cannot achieve the sublime in our lifetimes. But some people are more resilient to this conditioning than others, the reason of which is not quite clear and varies from person to person, and they are able to retain more of their experience of the fantasy of existence than others. They are not necessarily more or less fortunate than those of us who are more entrenched in a material conception of reality. Everyone's experience brings with it its own unique challenges that in no way can be compared to each other. It's just that God prefers the dreamers and misses the time when she herself spent her days dreaming. So she was sitting there on the bench made of wooden slats, and she saw a youngish lady leaning against the balustrade, looking at everything, looking at the clouds, which were thick then as they are now, and appeared not to move, the Williamsburg Bridge, across which trains and cars thrummed, the Brooklyn coast, with all of the new rich people developments that have populated it, and the water, which, along with the clouds, alone remains aloof from the trivialities of life which so obsess us. But it cannot be helped that we concern ourselves with petty and harmful things, for we are alive, and the clouds and the river are not. When the girl had been standing there for at least 10 minutes, God knew that she had stopped looking at the clouds, the bridge, the coast, and the water, and had begun seeing beyond the apparent reality, and was dreaming. So God smiled and carefully stood up. She felt lightheaded when she stood up, and her long, thick, ratty hair fluttered around, and she had to use her hand to brush it out of her face. God went up to the dreaming girl and said, "Hi, I'm God. Who are you?" At first the girl didn't hear God, because God spoke quietly, but God repeated herself, and the girl jumped a little. And when she turned to see who had spoken to her, God saw that she had a lovely face, with a mole to the right of her right eye. And her eyes told God that she was afraid that God might be some sort of troublesome character. So God said, I was sitting there on that bench, and I saw you come up. And the way you were looking out at the world, you reminded me of myself when I was your age. The girl relaxed a little and exhaled, saying, Oh, hi. Yeah, I love it here. It's so peaceful. I come here to just let go. What do you have to let go of? Oh, all sorts of things. You know, like worries and cares and a bunch of old traumas and that sort of thing. God smiled. Have you ever tried letting go of your breath? The girl looked at God, sizing her up. So I'm guessing you're into meditation and that sort of thing? I guess you could say so. I never got your name, by the way. Oh, I'm Ellie. What's your name? I'm God. You're God? Like, is that your name, or is that, like, who you are? Well, it is funny because God's the only person whose name is also their definition. Sorry to ask this, but, like, how do I know you're not just some crazy person or, like, some con artist or something? Well, you don't, haha, and neither do I. But let me ask you, Ellie, how do you know that you're not just a crazy person or a con artist? Sheesh. I can see that I'm kind of out of my league here. Well, God, so, what happened since you were my age? Did something change? Are you no longer the type of person who likes to come out and look at the river? I mean, you're here, after all, by the river. God laughed. Yes, you're right. How funny. I suppose I am here by the river, so perhaps not much has changed. But Ellie, let me tell you, when I was your age, I knew that if nothing went horribly wrong, I'd have at least 40 years left with which to make my dreams come true. And it's just that with every subsequent year that passed, it became clear to me that actually something had gone horribly wrong, that I was witnessing my own defeat. And that's a horrible thing, Ellie, to watch yourself get old and to watch nothing change, to watch your dreams remain dreams no matter how hard you try to realize them. And before I knew it, I could barely remember what my dream even was in the first place. But I could remember that it had something to do with the river, and that's why I keep coming back here. There was a moment of silence between them, during which the only sound was the clumping of the water below and the sly wind passing through the bare branches. Finally, Ellie looked up, and her hair was thick and yellow and curly, and so much blood was coursing through the veins beneath her neck. And when she is with a boy, she lets him kiss and suck on her neck, and the boy doesn't know that he's tasting divinity, and the boy doesn't know how to be divine himself. And she lets him kiss her, and she closes her eyes, and there are stars behind her eyelids, and she watches them and pretends that the stars are kissing her. And her eyes are blue, and she looked at God, and she saw for a moment that she was talking to herself. And the tiles of the pavement at her feet began to fall out from under her, and the East River fell off the face of the earth, and she wanted to follow it. She wanted to know why she's breathing, but she knew by the look in God's eyes that the answer is worse than sex. The answer is worse than breath. So she said the words of a fool, which was all she could say, because she had always wanted to meet God, and now that God was here before her and was wrapped in a thin shawl and had cataracts in her eyes and was staring off at the water with the pain that kills poets and mothers and fathers and priests, she realized that God is not to be worshipped, but to be pitied more than anyone, and thereby revered, for having to watch the moon always wax and wane and never remain the same. And she said, "Wow, that's a sobering thought. Thanks for sharing. I guess I'll try to learn from your experience." God took her eyes off the water and looked over at her. She wanted to reach over and grab Ellie's face and kiss her on the cheeks and the lips and the forehead. Her hand twitched, almost reaching out, but she caught herself.
"What is your dream, Ellie?"
Ellie had hoped God wouldn't ask that question. Well, I guess it's hard to put into words. It's pretty abstract, you know? I see a grassy field and lots of tennis shoes in the grass, and trees all around and short sleeves. I see full cups and a hairy arm. Not too hairy, just the right amount. I see a walker. I see a walking stick. I hear little voices singing off key. God looked away. She couldn't bear to hear that awful music. Why did she ask for it? It served her right. That awful music of a steadily burning heart, which will someday run out of fuel.
"Let me tell you a story, Ellie. Once there was a man who committed a terrible crime and was sentenced to life in prison. Well, so he went to prison and he stayed there for many years. And he learned many lessons, and the prison was made of bricks that had been painted white. And the prisoners had to wear an orange jumpsuit, and the food they gave the prisoners was generally bland and unenjoyable. And the man made many friends, and he got into many fights, and he cried some nights, and he cursed at God other nights. Well, time passed, and eventually it became clear to the man that he was going to die soon. So he started taking stock of his life, and he thought about the fact that he had only lived 30 years in the outside world and had now spent more time in prison than he had in the outside world. And he thought about his crime, and he hid his face behind his hands. And God could still see his face. And one night the man went to bed, and he awoke to the sound of jangling keys and a lock sliding in a door. And he felt a pressure on his right shoulder, and it was a gentle pressure. And the man could feel that a hand was touching him, and it was squeezing him gently, and it seemed to be laughing. So the man got out of bed, and he saw that the door to his cell was open. So he got out of bed quickly and crept over to the door and took a step out into the hallway. And there weren't any guards anywhere. So he took a few steps out into the hallway and took a peek into the cell next to his. And the prisoner there was sleeping, and his door was locked. And the man began to walk more quickly now, and when he came to the next door, he found that it was unlocked as well. So he stole off down the hallways, and each door upon which he came was unlocked. Soon he found himself at the front door of the prison, and it was closed. But when he put his hand against it, it swung open with a faint creak, and the man stepped into the open air, and it was chilly, and the sky was clear, and the man could see so many stars. And he fell to his knees and began to weep because he realized that he was dead.
God had tears in her eyes, and so did Ellie. "Well," said Ellie, "I'm really overwhelmed. I need to go now. Bye." And she scampered off in haste. God sighed and watched the river for a little while until she figured it was about 11, at which point she turned around and trudged back towards the Lower East Side. By the time she got back to the Bowery Mission, she had missed lunch, so she sighed and walked over to Washington Square Park. The fountain was off, as it should be, seeing as it's November, and there weren't many people around, and those who were, God had met already and didn't much like. She sat on a bench and stared at the arch and thought about how she could only walk and sit and stand and jump All the other actions she can take are done concurrently with one of these superior actions. So she sat on the bench for a long time, until she forgot her aching body, her aching heart, the park, the people in the park, her empty belly, and even herself entirely. But soon enough, it all came back to her, and a few tears fell from her eyes. She slowly stood up and walked over to Washington Place, where she let herself fall into a pile of garbage in exhaustion. She slept, if you could call it that, for a few hours, at which point she realized that if she didn't wake up soon and get moving, she'd miss dinner too.